I was fully awake when the doctor told me I wasn't allowed to leave. It was close to midnight, the kind of quiet hospital hour where even the machines seemed to breathe softly. I was dressed, shoes on, discharge papers folded neatly in my bag. In less than 8 hours, I was supposed to be sitting in a law office conference room for my grandmother's property transfer signing. For the first time in my life, my presence wasn't optional. It was required. The doctor didn't raise his voice. He didn't sound concerned. He simply flipped open a file and said, "You've been withdrawn from discharge." I laughed, just once, because it made no sense. I had been cleared earlier that afternoon. He turned the file toward me and tapped a page. My name, my birth date, a signature that looked enough like mine to make my stomach drop. The timestamp said it had been filed a few hours earlier. "That isn't my signature," I said. He nodded, almost sympathetically. "Even so, once a withdrawal is filed, we're legally obligated to keep you." That was the moment I understood something was wrong. Not accidentally wrong, precisely wrong. Someone had used hospital paperwork to trap me here. And there was only one person who had access to my information tonight. My sister, Beatrice. After the doctor left, the room felt smaller. I called the nurse's station and asked who submitted the form. The nurse hesitated, her voice shifting into something practiced. She said she wasn't allowed to disclose names. I asked if the form had been submitted electronically. Another pause. Then she said no. It had been done in person. My phone buzzed, a text from my mother. "Did you make it home safely?" I stared at the screen, my pulse slowing into something cold and deliberate. They already believed I was gone. Or worse, they believed I wouldn't be able to show up. I tried calling the family lawyer, straight to voicemail. I left a message anyway, my voice calm, careful, as if I weren't sitting in a hospital bed with my autonomy quietly erased. When I hung up, the room felt heavy with the kind of silence that comes before something breaks. Beatrice arrived not long after, as if summoned by the moment. She smiled too quickly when she saw me, her concern polished and gentle. She said she just wanted to check on me. She told me not to stress, that paperwork mistakes happened all the time. She said the most important thing was my health. Her hand rested on the edge of the bed a second too long. She already knew I wasn't going anywhere. I asked her how she knew the signing was scheduled for 9 sharp. I hadn't told her that. She waved it off, saying Mom mentioned it earlier. Then she suggested I stop pushing the hospital staff, that I didn't want to seem difficult. That was when I felt it settle into place. The calm, the certainty. This wasn't concern, it was containment. After she left, the doctor returned with hospital administration. They repeated the same explanation, slower this time, as if clarity would soften it. Even if the form was forged, protocol required review. The earliest possible discharge would be late morning. Too late. I sat there, capable, alert, and legally voiceless. I had built my entire adult life around being reliable, composed, professional, and now a single sheet of paper had stripped all of that away. My mother called again, her tone relaxed. She said, "We'll talk after everything's settled." Beatrice sent a message right after. "Don't worry, I've handled it." Handled it. The nurse who brought my water didn't meet my eyes. When she did, briefly, there was something there. Not pity. Warning. I asked her quietly if I could request copies of everything in my file. She nodded, just once, and said she'd see what she could do. I sat alone after that, staring at the door. I imagined the law office across town, the long table, the folders stacked in order. I imagined my name printed neatly on the attendance list. I imagined it being called once, then again, followed by silence. I could already see the way my absence would be interpreted. Unreliable. Emotional. Typical. I had spent my entire life being the daughter they never chose, the one praised for not needing anything, for staying out of the way. Independence had been my armor. Tonight, it had been used against me. I stopped trying to sleep. I stopped hoping for release. I began writing things down instead. Times, names, the exact phrasing everyone had used. If I couldn't leave, I could at least remember. Just before dawn, my phone buzzed again. A message from the lawyer. "They've begun. Your name was called." A second message followed a few seconds later. "And when you didn't answer, the room changed." I closed my eyes, the quiet of the hospital pressing in around me. Whatever they thought they had secured by keeping me here, they were wrong. This wasn't the end of my voice. It was the moment they exposed themselves. By the time the hallway lights dimmed again and the night nurse took over, I wasn't afraid anymore. That surprised me. I should have been panicking, rehearsing arguments, begging for release. Instead, I lay there wide awake, listening to the steady rhythm of the monitors, feeling something colder and steadier settle into my chest. What had happened tonight didn't feel new. It felt familiar, like the latest version of a pattern I had spent my entire life pretending not to see. Families don't usually announce who they favor. They don't need to. They show you in quieter ways. Who gets asked first? Who gets forgiven without explanation? Who gets protected when the truth would be inconvenient? After my father died, the house changed almost overnight. My mother didn't collapse the way people expected. She reorganized. She tightened schedules, cleaned relentlessly, filled every silence with tasks, and she poured herself into Beatrice. My younger sister was suddenly fragile, overwhelmed, in need of guidance and reassurance. I was the other thing, the one who seemed fine. "You're so strong," my mother used to say when I didn't cry. "You don't need me the way she does." It sounded like praise. It took me years to understand it was a withdrawal. I learned early that if I needed less, I would receive less. So I stopped asking. I handled my own school forms, my own college applications, my own problems. When decisions were made about the family, they were announced to me afterward, as if participation were a courtesy rather than a right. Beatrice sat at the table. I stood in the doorway, nodding along. The first time I noticed it clearly, I was 16. My mother and Beatrice had decided to move her into the larger bedroom while I was at school. They said it made sense. She needed more space. I didn't argue. I just moved my things. That became our rhythm. Beatrice needed. I adjusted. My grandparents were the only ones who ever seemed unsettled by that arrangement. My grandfather didn't speak loudly or often, but he watched. He noticed who stayed late to help clean up after family gatherings. He noticed who listened more than they talked. When I started studying architecture, he was the one who asked me why, not what kind of job it would lead to. Why? I told him I liked the way buildings held people's lives without asking for credit. He smiled at that. He started leaving books on my desk when I visited. Old sketches, notes in the margins, quiet lessons about responsibility disguised as stories about concrete and steel. My grandmother was gentler, but no less deliberate. She asked questions no one else bothered to ask. How I was sleeping, what I wanted, not what I was planning. She had a way of looking at me that made me feel seen without being examined. When she died, I waited for something. A note. A conversation I had missed. Anything that would confirm that connection hadn't been imagined. Nothing came. Beatrice handled the paperwork, told me Grandma wasn't sentimental about objects or letters. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? Lying in that hospital bed, I thought about how easily I had accepted that explanation. How often I had accepted things because questioning them would have made me difficult. The signing tomorrow mattered because it broke that pattern. For once, the process required me. Not my compliance, not my silence. Me, my physical presence, my signature. I was no longer a courtesy. That was why tonight had happened. Once I let that thought surface, others followed. Moments I had dismissed before, rearranging themselves into something sharper. The projects I had been quietly dropped from without explanation. The bids that went nowhere. The lenders who suddenly went cold after initial enthusiasm. I had blamed timing, industry politics, bad luck. But Beatrice had always been involved in the administrative side of the family. She was good with details. That was my mother's phrase. Whenever paperwork appeared, it passed through Beatrice's hands. Whenever something needed to be explained away, she handled it. My phone buzzed again. A message from Beatrice, cheerful and brief. Try to rest. We'll sort everything out tomorrow. I stared at the word longer than necessary. I remembered how she had known the exact time of the signing without me telling her. How comfortable she had been in the hospital. How easily she had spoken to staff. How confident she was that things would proceed without me. I wasn't invisible because I lacked presence. I was invisible because I had been predictable. Around 3 a.m, I sat up and opened the Notes app on my phone. I started listing things, not accusations, facts, dates, access points, times Beatrice had handled documents that involved my name, medical forms, company filings, family records. I didn't know yet what any of it meant, but I knew this much. What happened tonight wasn't an isolated betrayal. It was leverage built over time. Independence, I realized, had made me convenient. I hadn't needed help, so no one had worried about taking advantage. When dawn began to thin the darkness at the edge of the window, I felt something else settle in. Not anger. Recognition. I finally understood what being overlooked had cost me. It hadn't just hurt. It had created cover. They thought I wouldn't notice. They were wrong. I put the phone down and looked at the door again, not with dread this time, but with intent. I didn't know yet how the truth would surface or who it would expose. I only knew that I was done enduring. For the first time, I wasn't waiting to be included. I was paying attention. By early morning, I stopped thinking about how unfair it was and started thinking about what could still be proven. The sky outside my hospital window was turning that pale gray that comes before sunrise. My phone battery hovered just above red. I hadn't slept, but my thoughts felt sharper than they had in years. Panic wastes energy. Focus conserves it. Whatever Beatrice thought she had accomplished, she had done it with paperwork. Paperwork could be traced. My phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered on the second ring. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and careful with my name. It was the family attorney. He asked me to confirm my identity twice before he said anything else. That alone told me this wasn't a routine courtesy call. He confirmed the will announcement, and the property transfer signing were scheduled to begin that morning. Then he paused and said something that tightened my grip on the phone. Your physical presence is mandatory. No proxy is permitted. I told him I was being held at the hospital due to a discharge withdrawal I hadn't signed. There was a longer silence this time. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. There is a supplemental provision in the will, he said. I can't discuss details over the phone, but I need to ask you something directly. Are you safe, and are you able to attend? He hadn't asked if I wanted to attend. He asked if I was able. That was when it clicked fully into place. My absence wasn't a convenience. It was the condition they needed to move forward without resistance. I asked him what would happen if I didn't appear. He chose his words carefully. The meeting would proceed, he said, but certain actions would be delayed. Others would not. I could hear people moving in the background, the early signs of preparation. He told me to document everything and remain calm. This isn't the first irregularity we've encountered, he added quietly. Please keep your phone on. After the call ended, I stared at the screen until it dimmed. Beatrice hadn't just wanted me out of the room. She had wanted me silent and unreachable. I replayed the night before with new clarity. The way she had arrived so quickly, how she'd spoken to the nurse as if she belonged there, how confident she had been that everything would work out. She hadn't been guessing. She'd known exactly how the signing worked. I swung my legs off the bed and walked to the door, ignoring the faint protest in my muscles. I asked the doctor what documentation would allow immediate release. He didn't hesitate. Only a reversal signed by the same party who submitted the withdrawal. So the person who forged my signature is the only one who can free me, I said. He didn't argue. That was the trap. Clean, efficient, designed to look like protocol instead of sabotage. I called the attorney back and told him directly that my sister had submitted forged medical paperwork to prevent my attendance. He went silent for several seconds, then said he would handle it. The way he said it told me he already was. My mother texted again. This time, the tone was casual, almost relieved. Looks like it's going to be a long morning. Take care of yourself. Beatrice followed with a single line. Don't worry, I'll explain everything. That message did something final inside me. It wasn't concern, it was confirmation. She believed the outcome was already secured. I opened a fresh note and began recording details. The exact time the withdrawal had been filed, the names of the doctors I'd spoken to, the nurse who had hinted I should request copies, the timestamps on every message I'd received from my family since the night before. I didn't know yet what would matter, but I knew memory alone wouldn't be enough. As I typed, something steadier replaced the fear. I had spent years doubting myself, wondering why doors closed without explanation. Now I could see the structure beneath the chaos. This wasn't incompetence or coincidence. It was design. The architect in me recognized it instantly. Every system leaves fingerprints. A few minutes before the scheduled start time, my phone buzzed again. A message from the attorney. They're gathering. Another followed. Your name will be called first. I imagined the room, the long table, the folders arranged in order, my chair empty. Then another message appeared. If you do not appear, the meeting will proceed. He wrote, but not the way your family expects. I exhaled slowly and leaned back against the bed. For the first time since the doctor had shown me that forged signature, I felt something close to control. Beatrice had assumed my absence would erase me. She hadn't considered what it would reveal. The hospital room felt different now, less like a cage, more like a holding space before impact. I checked my phone battery again and plugged it into the wall. Whatever was unfolding, I needed to stay connected. I wasn't there to interrupt them. I was there to witness what happened when the plan broke. As the sun finally cleared the horizon, I realized something else. Quieter, but no less important. For years, I had been trying to earn a place I was never meant to beg for. This time, I didn't need to fight my way into the room. The truth was already walking in for me. The morning of the signing arrived quietly, as if nothing important were about to be decided. The hospital hallway was still dim, the kind of half-light that makes time feel suspended. I was fully dressed again, bag at my feet, discharge papers now useless weight. When the nurse came in, her voice was gentle but firm. The review board wouldn't meet until later that morning. There was nothing she could do. I didn't argue. I asked to see the document one more time. The administrator brought it in, crisp and official. The discharge withdrawal form sat at the top, my name printed cleanly, the signature just familiar enough to unsettle me. I studied the pressure of the pen, the way the letters leaned slightly to the right. It was careful, practiced. Someone had taken time to get it right. This was submitted in person. I said. The administrator nodded. With identification. That was the part that landed hardest. This hadn't been a rushed decision or a desperate move. It had been planned. Someone had walked into this building knowing exactly what they needed to say, what they needed to show, and when to do it. I told them again that I was mentally competent and physically cleared. They didn't disagree. They explained liability instead. Forged or not, the form triggered a mandatory hold. Until it was reversed, my consent didn't matter. The wall wasn't concrete or steel, it was policy, and it was absolute. My phone buzzed. A message from my mother. Everything's starting. Try not to worry. No question, no concern, just confirmation. Beatrice followed a moment later. Don't stress, I've handled it. I read that sentence twice, then set the phone face down. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of watching me respond. I asked for copies of everything in my file. The junior nurse from the night shift hesitated, then nodded. She told me it might take time. When she left, she glanced back once, her eyes apologetic. She knew this wasn't right, but knowing didn't change procedure. I sat alone again and imagined the law office across town, the long table, the neat stacks of paper, coffee being poured into white cups, chairs pulled out, then pushed back in as people took their places. My chair empty. I could already hear how it would be framed. Ashley couldn't make it. Ashley wasn't well. Ashley wasn't ready. It was always easy to explain my absence. The first message from the attorney came through at 9 sharp. They've begun. I felt the time snap into place, like a clock clicking forward after being stuck all night. I stared at the screen, my heart steady, my hands calm. Another message followed. Your name was called. I imagined the pause, the polite wait, the way eyes would turn toward the door, then back to the table. The moment where silence starts to feel uncomfortable. Seconds later, my phone buzzed again. And when you didn't answer, the room changed. I closed my eyes, not in relief, but in recognition. This was the moment Beatrice had counted on. This was the moment she thought would pass without consequence. The nurse returned with a stack of papers and set them on the tray table. Intake logs, timestamps, badge entries. I scanned them quickly, my mind sorting details into patterns. The form had been submitted late the night before. The ID scanned belonged to a family member, not a physician, not an advocate. My phone rang. The number was blocked. I answered without speaking. This is Detective Harris, a man said. I need to confirm your identity. I gave it to him. He asked if I was currently hospitalized against my will. I said yes. Good, he said. Then you're exactly where we need you to be. He told me the forged discharge paperwork had already raised flags. Not because it was sloppy, but because it wasn't. Because the same name appeared in other places it shouldn't. Business filings, short-term construction loans, materials accounts opened and closed quickly, always paid just enough to avoid scrutiny. All in my name. My grip tightened on the phone. I told him I hadn't authorized any of it. He said he knew. We're not here because of what happened last night, he said. We're here because last night was a mistake. I looked at the documents on the tray, at the neat columns of dates and initials. Years of quiet interference suddenly visible. Doors that closed without explanation. Opportunities that vanished. It hadn't been bad luck. It had been leverage. Another message came in from the attorney, rapid this time. The conference room door just opened. I could see it as clearly as if I were there. 2 officers stepping inside. Calm. Unhurried. The kind of presence that doesn't ask for permission. My attorney's next message appeared a moment later. They're asking a question. Then, after a pause that felt deliberate even through text. Which one of you is Beatrice Bennett? I leaned back against the pillows and let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The hospital room no longer felt like a trap. It felt like distance, perspective. The detective stayed on the line, explaining what would happen next. Identity confirmation, document requests, questions that couldn't be waved away with confidence or charm. The room my sister thought she controlled had shifted. I didn't feel triumph. I felt alignment. For the first time, my absence wasn't being used to erase me. It was being used to expose them. The final message from the attorney arrived a few minutes later. "She tried to speak for you," it read. "I told her she couldn't." I stared at the screen, then at the ceiling, the morning light finally bright enough to reach the edges of the room. Whatever Beatrice thought she had secured by keeping me here, she had miscalculated. Paper can silence a person, but it can also tell the truth, and today it was doing both. The first thing my attorney told me was that my name had been called before anything else. I wasn't there to hear it, but I could picture the moment perfectly. The long table, the neat folders, the quiet expectation that I would answer, that I would walk in late and apologize, that the delay would still bend in their favor. Instead, there was silence. Not the polite kind, the kind that forces people to look at each other. My attorney's message came through in short bursts as things unfolded. They waited. Another pause. "Your sister spoke." That didn't surprise me. Beatrice never tolerated gaps. She filled them instinctively, confidently, as if space itself belonged to her. According to my attorney, she stood and explained that I was unwell, that I had asked her to handle things, that she was only trying to help keep everything moving. She said it smoothly. Too smoothly. The attorney asked for documentation. That was when the room shifted. Beatrice produced papers she'd brought with her, already prepared. Statements, copies, explanations layered carefully enough to sound reasonable. My mother sat quietly beside her, hands folded, eyes lowered, as if this were all unfortunate but necessary. My attorney stopped messaging mid-sentence. A minute passed. Then another. When the next message came through, it was different. The door just opened. I was sitting upright in my hospital bed, phone pressed to my ear as Detective Harris stayed on the line. I could hear the change in his breathing when I told him what the attorney had just said. "Good," he replied. "Then we're on schedule." 2 police officers walked into the conference room without urgency. No raised voices, no dramatic interruption. One of them simply asked a question in a tone that suggested patience, not negotiation. "Which one of you is Beatrice Bennett?" The way my attorney described it later, the room went still in layers. Beatrice reacted first, her expression tightening before she smoothed it back into composure. My mother looked up sharply, then away. No one else spoke. My attorney messaged again. "She's answering." Another pause. "They're asking her to step aside." On my end, Detective Harris confirmed what I was already feeling in my bones. The forged hospital paperwork wasn't being treated as an isolated incident. It had been connected to a larger investigation that had been unfolding quietly for months. Multiple business filings had been opened in my name. Short-term construction loans, materials credit lines, vendor accounts, all of them small enough individually to avoid immediate alarms, but together they formed a pattern. Money moved, credit extended, obligations created. I hadn't signed any of it. Several documents had been executed while I was verifiably out of state or on site with clients, nowhere near the locations where signatures were submitted. Someone had been counting on the assumption that I wouldn't look too closely, that I would absorb the consequences without asking why. Beatrice had mistaken silence for consent. The detective told me the earliest filings dated back to just after my grandmother's death. right around the time Beatrice had been entrusted with family paperwork and informal oversight. She had access. She had motive. And she had time. I closed my eyes briefly, not to escape the information, but to let it settle. Years of confusion suddenly aligned. The projects I'd lost without explanation, the lenders who'd smiled and then disappeared, the quiet reputational damage I'd never been able to trace. It hadn't been failure. It had been sabotage disguised as competence. Another message from my attorney. She tried to assert privilege on your behalf. I almost laughed. She can't, he followed. I told her she has no authority. The officers asked Beatrice for identification. Then they asked about the documents she'd brought. Then they asked why some of those documents bore my name, but not my handwriting. The questions were calm, sequential, impossible to deflect with charm alone. My mother still hadn't spoken. The detective told me something else then, something colder. Beatrice hadn't planned for tonight to become public. She'd expected a clean execution. My absence would be explained away. The signing would proceed in pieces. Anything questionable could be handled quietly later. The forged discharge paperwork had been the mistake. It created a paper trail too bold to ignore. On the other end of the line, I could hear the faint echo of voices as Detective Harris coordinated with officers on site. Names, dates, requests for additional records, the kind of language that narrows options instead of expanding them. My attorney's next message arrived slower, as if he were choosing each word. They're placing her under arrest. I didn't feel a surge of victory. I felt something steadier, a sense that gravity had finally been restored. She's looking at your mother, he added. She's asking her to say something. I imagined Beatrice turning, panic finally cracking her control, imagined her expecting rescue, just once. My mother said nothing. The room, my attorney told me later, absorbed that silence differently. It wasn't confusion, it was recognition. The detective on my line confirmed the charges being prepared: forgery, financial fraud, identity misuse, obstruction of legal process. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern with consequences. I looked around the hospital room, at the pale walls and the steady monitors. The place I'd been trapped only hours earlier now felt like a distance buffer between me and the chaos unfolding elsewhere. What happens next? I asked. The detective's answer was simple. Evidence would be secured, statements taken. The will would be reread with new context, and my presence would be required. For the first time that day, I smiled. My attorney sent one final message before things went quiet. What happened at the hospital wasn't the beginning. It read, it was the mistake. I set the phone down and stared at the ceiling, the morning light now fully filling the room. Beatrice had tried to remove me from the process by force. Instead, she had placed herself at the center of it. I wasn't scrambling to catch up anymore. I was exactly where the truth needed me to be. The noise faded faster than I expected. After the calls ended and the messages stopped coming through, the hospital room felt unnaturally quiet. The crisis had paused, not resolved, like a storm that moves just far enough away for you to hear your own breathing again. Detective Harris told me Beatrice had been taken in for questioning. Not arrested yet, detained. The difference mattered legally, but emotionally, the damage was already irreversible. What surprised me was how little satisfaction I felt. I thought exposure would feel louder, vindicating. Instead, it felt heavy, like something buried for years had finally surfaced and was now asking to be carried properly. Late that afternoon, after the doctors confirmed there was no longer any medical reason to keep me, a man I hadn't seen in years asked to speak with me privately. He introduced himself as Daniel Rhodes, a former legal advisor to my grandfather. His voice was measured, almost careful, as if he were stepping onto ground he had been instructed not to disturb until now. He said my grandfather had left explicit instructions. If anything interfered with the will, if I was delayed, isolated, or prevented from appearing in person, Daniel was to wait until the situation stabilized and then find me directly. He carried a small leather case. Inside were 2 items: a sealed envelope with my name written in my grandmother's handwriting and a USB drive. These were never meant to pass through family hands, he said quietly. I didn't open either right away. I needed to know why now. Daniel explained that after my grandmother died, my grandfather noticed things missing. Not valuables, not money. Papers, drafts, a particular design she had worked on privately for years. He had assumed it was misplaced at first. Then he saw it wasn't. He suspected Beatrice almost immediately, but suspicion without proof would have destroyed the family without protecting the company. So he waited. He watched, and when patterns emerged, he prepared. I asked why he hadn't warned me. Daniel didn't flinch. Your grandfather believed you would confront her the moment you knew, he said, and he believed she would destroy evidence if she felt threatened. He wanted the truth intact when it surfaced. I understood that instinct painfully well. After Daniel left, I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed. I opened the envelope first. The paper inside was thin, creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. My grandmother's handwriting slanted gently, confident but warm. Reading her words felt like stepping into a room I hadn't known I'd been locked out of. She wrote about watching me grow quietly capable, about seeing how often I stepped back so others could step forward, about knowing that leadership wasn't volume, but steadiness. She said the company didn't need someone who needed control. It needed someone who understood responsibility. She wrote that she had left me something meaningful. Not money. Direction. My hands shook as I finished the letter. Then I inserted the USB drive into my laptop. My grandfather appeared on the screen, older than I remembered him, but alert. His voice was calm, precise, stripped of sentiment. He explained that my grandmother had created an original architectural design years earlier, a conceptual blueprint for the future of the company. It wasn't intended to be built exactly as drawn. It was meant to guide philosophy, scale, ethics. That design had gone missing shortly after her death. I believe Beatrice took it, he said plainly, and I believe she did so because she understood its value, but not its purpose. He explained how he had begun quietly tracking financial irregularities after that. Small things at first, documents passing through the wrong hands, decisions being made without proper authorization, my name appearing in places it shouldn't have. I wanted to protect you, he said, and I wanted to protect what your grandmother built. He admitted he had waited too long, that he had hoped preparation would be enough. His voice softened then, just for a moment. If you are watching this because you were prevented from attending the signing, he said, then she has made her move. I closed the laptop and sat there in silence, the weight of it pressing into my chest. What Beatrice had taken wasn't just credit or opportunity. She had taken the map. The thing that might have anchored me when I was doubting myself most. Daniel returned later that evening with an update. Investigators had confirmed my mother had been informed years earlier that something was missing from the estate. Not specifics. Just enough to raise questions. She had chosen not to ask them. Silence, I realized, had protected comfort for a long time. Detective Harris called soon after. The investigation was expanding. The will would need to be reread in light of new evidence. The original design would be presented as part of the record. My presence was required again. This time, I would not be delayed. When I was finally discharged and stepped outside, The air felt sharper than I remembered. Clean. Honest. I carried the envelope and the USB drive with me, like fragile proof of something I had always felt but never been able to name. That night, alone in a quiet hotel room, I spread the design out on the table. The lines were confident, intentional. There was nothing accidental about it. It didn't demand attention. It earned it. I understood then why my grandparents had waited, why everything had been structured to activate only under pressure. This wasn't revenge. It was containment. Beatrice had tried to erase me from the process. Instead, she had exposed exactly why I belonged at its center. The future she tried to steal was about to be placed back in the open, and this time, it would not be hidden again. I walked back into the law office with the design rolled carefully under my arm. The same conference room waited at the end of the hallway, but the atmosphere had shifted. Conversations stopped when I entered. Chairs scraped softly as people adjusted, unsure whether to stand or sit. I felt their eyes on me, measuring, recalibrating. For years, I had been the absence they explained away. Now I was the variable they hadn't planned for. I took my seat without a word and placed the roll at the center of the table. The attorney noticed it immediately. His hand paused over his notes, his eyes narrowing with recognition, before he masked it with professionalism. Across from me, Beatrice froze. It wasn't dramatic, just a slight tightening of her jaw, the smallest break in her control. She knew exactly what it was. "We are reconvening," the attorney said, his voice steady. "Due to material evidence that must be entered into the record." He gestured toward the roll. I unfastened it and spread the paper flat. The design was unmistakably hand-drafted, the lines confident, purposeful, not decorative, intentional. The attorney leaned forward, reading the notations, the dates in the margins. He looked up at me once, then back down again. "This document," he said slowly, "was referenced in a sealed addendum." Beatrice shifted in her chair. The attorney continued, explaining that the will would be read again in full, not as a courtesy, as a correction. My grandfather's written explanation followed, his words clinical and clear. He outlined why the distribution of assets wasn't based on sentiment or bloodlines, but on stewardship, on who had demonstrated integrity when no one was watching. "This is not favoritism," the attorney read aloud. "This is restitution." The room absorbed that word in silence. The majority ownership of the company was assigned to me, not conditionally, not temporarily, with responsibility outlined as clearly as the transfer itself. Ethical oversight, transparent governance, leadership grounded in accountability. I accepted without ceremony. No smile, no speech. There was nothing to celebrate. Something had been set right. That was all. Beatrice stood abruptly. She said there had been a misunderstanding, that she had only been trying to help, that she hadn't meant for things to escalate. Her voice wavered when she said my name, as if familiarity could soften the moment. The officers stepped forward then, calm and precise. They listed the charges clearly: forgery of medical records, financial fraud, identity misuse, obstruction of legal process. There was no accusation in their tone, only fact. The handcuffs clicked quietly around her wrists, the sound almost polite. Beatrice didn't look at me. She turned instead to our mother. "Say something," she said, her voice breaking for the first time. "Tell them you knew. Tell them I wasn't doing this alone." The room held its breath. My mother didn't move. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. It wasn't denial, it was exposure. Years of choosing comfort over truth condensed into a single, irreversible moment. An investigator addressed her directly, outlining what they had uncovered, what she had been told, what she had chosen not to question. She wouldn't be arrested that day, but her role would be entered into the record. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Everything that mattered was already visible. As Beatrice was led from the room, the design remained on the table. No one touched it. It felt like a boundary no one dared cross. The attorney cleared his throat and asked if I wanted it returned to storage. No, I said. He nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. When the room finally emptied, I stood alone for a moment, looking at the lines my grandmother had drawn. They weren't perfect. They didn't try to be. They trusted the person holding them to understand what came next. I rolled the paper carefully, not as a relic, but as a tool. For years, I had mistaken quiet for weakness. I had mistaken endurance for insignificance. Today corrected that error without raising its voice. I walked out of the building into the late afternoon light, the city moving around me as if nothing had changed, but everything had. What had been taken from me in silence had been returned in daylight. And for the first time, I wasn't stepping into a space I had to justify. I was stepping into one that had been waiting. The weeks after the will reading passed without drama, and that was exactly how I knew it was real. The legal consequences unfolded quietly. Beatrice's charges moved forward through the courts, methodical and unforgiving. There were no emotional appeals left to make, no narratives she could reshape to her advantage. My mother faced civil accountability for what she had chosen to ignore. No prison sentence, no spectacle, just the permanent weight of a record that could no longer be rewritten. The family structure I had grown up inside collapsed without noise, like a building that had been hollowed out long before anyone noticed the cracks. I didn't feel grief the way I expected to. I felt finished. I returned to my apartment in Chicago to pack, moving through the rooms with a strange sense of detachment. The place had been designed around proving something. Every late night, every polished presentation, every compromise had been part of an unspoken argument I was always making. Standing there now, I realized I didn't need to win that argument anymore. So, I didn't stay. I left the city quietly and drove back to the original headquarters of the family company, the one my grandparents had built from nothing. The building wasn't impressive. It didn't need to be. It was solid, functional, honest in the way only places built with intention ever are. When I walked in, people looked up cautiously, unsure of what version of me they were meeting. I didn't announce myself. I listened. The ones who had always been there, the project managers who stayed late, the engineers who argued with integrity instead of ego, the longtime staff who remembered my grandparents by name, they were the ones who stepped forward first. Not to flatter, to work. Trust revealed itself without being asked. I took leadership slowly, deliberately. I didn't try to replace what had been taken from me. I built what had been denied. Transparency became policy, not performance. Decisions were documented, not whispered. Credit went where it belonged. For the first time in my professional life, I wasn't bracing for something to be pulled out from under me. The architectural design my grandmother had drawn stayed in my office, unframed, used. It wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder. Build things that last. Build things that don't need to hide. Outside of work, my life simplified. I formed routines that felt steady instead of exhausting. I surrounded myself with people who didn't need me to be smaller to feel secure. Mentors, colleagues, quiet friendships built on mutual respect rather than obligation. I learned what safety felt like when it wasn't conditional. Family, I realized, was never about who claimed you. It was about who showed up without needing control. One evening, months later, I stood at a construction site as the sun dipped behind the scaffolding. Plans spread across the hood of a truck, dust on my shoes, the low hum of honest work around me. I wasn't tired in the way I used to be. I was grounded. There is a difference. What I had done wasn't revenge in the way people like to imagine it. I hadn't destroyed anyone for the sake of satisfaction. I had allowed the truth to become unavoidable. I had reclaimed authorship of my own life, not by shouting, but by refusing to disappear. If you've ever been erased quietly, overlooked because you were capable, sabotaged because you didn't demand attention, I want you to know something. Your silence does not mean consent. Your strength does not make you expendable. And your story does not end where someone else tried to trap it. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized too late that someone you trusted was working against you? Or found the courage to step away from a family dynamic that only took and never gave back? Stay with this channel for more stories about truth surfacing, power shifting, and people reclaiming the lives they were told to live quietly. And if you want to be part of this space, where invisible stories are finally seen, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Some endings are loud. The ones that matter most are the quiet beginnings that follow.